Okay, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where I interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning, as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest on this show. So today's guest, Purvi Vora, is someone who I've always been inspired by. A little bit about Purvi before we jump into this conversation. I have a lot of questions that I have written down, but hopefully we're able to get through some of them. So, Purvi has a PhD in science education from the Teachers College at Columbia University in New York City. She has worked in the education sector for close to 2 decades. She started her career teaching science and media literacy in an inner city school in Manhattan. She moved to India in 2007 and joined the Akanksha Foundation as a school leader for a charter school in Mumbai. She later worked at the American School of Bombay as the Community and Social Responsibility Coordinator, supporting K-12 teachers at the school in implementing service projects. She also taught science in the 7th grade at the school. With her business partner, Sangeeta Kapadia, Purvi set up Renaissance Education LLP, a boutique education consulting firm and think tank born out of a desire to promote learning that is empowering, joyful, and relevant to the 21st century learner. And she's also a homeschooling parent, and I'm hopeful we get to talk about that as well. Another thing I'd like to mention is the City as a Lab project, and I will be including links to Purvi's work, Purvi's social media profiles on the internet in the show notes, and any recommendations or references we do bring up in this conversation. So feel free to explore that during the conversation if you want to take a pause and explore those links. I think the City as Lab project is one of the most exciting project-based learning initiatives I have seen in Mumbai. Purvi and Sangeeta have run this for a long time in the city, and they are in the middle of a cohort right now. And I think you'll learn more through Purvi's words, but also through their wonderful website. And I was fortunate to play a small part as a reviewer this time, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And it was like being back in the classroom. So, Purvi, first question. Firstly, thank you for making time for this.
Welcome. Thank you for calling me, inviting me.
Great. So, Purvi, because you're an educator yourself, and I've always been so intrigued by how teachers think about their time in the classroom as students. So, the first question I wanted to ask you is, what are your memories of yourself growing up? Where did you grow up, and what did you enjoy studying at school, or what are
Mm,
your memories of school growing up as well? Is this an open-ended
mm.
question to start off?
So I'm a Mumbai girl. I was born here. I went to a very conventional convent school, a girls' school, in Prabhadevi, and that's where I was from K through 10. It was as traditional as you can define the word. So my surname is Vora. So I remember the first thing I remember is my roll number always being like 57, 60. That's how many kids there were in my class. I think when I think about my school, the thing that comes to my mind first are my friends. For me, school was all about my friends. It was not so much about the learning. In fact, I don't think I really enjoyed learning that much in school. I was a good student. I did well on my tests. It wasn't that I was a topper in my class or anything, but I did enough to not get yelled at by my parents or get in trouble. One of those kids who just goes under the radar. Like she's not excelling at anything, but she's not doing so badly that she's in anyone's spotlight. So I do remember one or two teachers very, very distinctly from my school. One was a nun, and she was transferred to our school only for 2 years, and she taught us a subject that was not given any importance called community living. I don't know if you had it when you were in school, but it was all these. So when the or the Christian students would go for their church and mass, we would have this period. And it was just basically sort of civic sense and, rules about society and listening to your parents and things like that. And she used to make it really interesting. So she was the first teacher that I had who would hold debates or ask for her opinion or ask us to write a poem about something. And that kind of stuff really interested me. So I remember her very, very clearly. I also remember one particular algebra teacher because I never understood math and so I never enjoyed it and so I never did well in it. And she would just come into the classroom and all she would do is write on the board. That's all she would do. She would rarely lecture, she would rarely talk, and she would rarely erase anything that she had written. So the entire board was filled with algebraic expressions and it used to confuse me and scare me a lot. So I remember that really well. I also remember getting into trouble in school. I was suspended for 3 days for something that, in hindsight, I feel was very minor. And my mom had to come and apologize to the principal. I had to go into the staff room and apologize. And I was in ninth grade and apologized to all the staff. And it was quite humiliating, but it had to be done. Otherwise, they wouldn't let me back. So since I left school, I've never gone back. So if that tells you anything about how I feel about my school. So I would say it was a very ordinary, typical experience. It was all about my friends and growing up, like coming into your own kind of a thing.
And like, what about home, Purvi? In terms of your parents' influence, I'm curious about what was that environment like for you, just in terms of maybe the exposure you had, to books, to media, to learning experiences. Also, growing up in Mumbai, was the city,
Mhm.
an opportunity? Were there opportunities in the city to maybe go to museums or talks that you were part of? So something around that, learning outside school and that part of your life.
Yeah. So I am, and I was very lucky that I grew up in a very open-minded home. It was just my mom, dad, my brother, and I. There were four of us. I lived walking distance from my school. I remember asking my mom why she picked that school, and she said because it was the closest one, and that was the criterion. But I had a ton of friends. We lived in a large society. My mom, even though I was scared of her, was not really very strict. She never really gave me any grief about grades or anything really. Even in my teenage years, when she found out like about boys and stuff, she never really ever, I remember her sitting down with me and like making me feel bad about myself. So I feel like I grew up with a lot of independence and a lot of uh, sort of their trust on me. And I've rarely broken that trust, perhaps because of that. Yes, we did do a lot of fun things. One thing I remember very well is we went for this Swan Lake ballet. I don't know how many years ago that was or even which hall it was in, but I remember going to that really, really well. And I remember that memory is very vivid. I remember we had a huge garden in the building that I grew up. So every day I would be down from 5 to 8 and it was just free play time. So there was a lot of play. Summer holidays were like most people growing up in my generation, there was really no agenda. There was no restriction on TV. I could watch TV. I didn't watch a lot of it. There was not that much to watch, but it was mainly just going to your friend's house, coming home, going back to your friend's house, coming home, going for a slumber party to your friend's house, coming home. So it was a lot of free play, a lot of freedom. I was an avid reader. My mom would sign me up for the subscriptions. Like I used to subscribe to this magazine called Misha, which was a Russian kind of a magazine, and then Tinkle. And then I remember every Diwali we would go to my native place and she would buy me like 10 Amar Chitra Kathas from the railway station. So I loved to read. I would be reading during lunch, I'd be reading during dinner, I'd be reading during any free time. So she encouraged that. And I also hence encourage it and enjoy doing it with my own son. I've been reading to him every single day since he was 4 months old. So uh, that's a habit that's been passed on.
Well, like, I wanted to ask you about that thing you mentioned, free play, Purvi, and I I've been talking to a lot of my friends, growing up in different generations in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And I've noticed as I move closer to the 30s and 20s, for people growing up in a city like Mumbai, the amount of free play, especially
Mm,
once technology slowly started integrating in your life. I think I grew up in the early 2000s, and I distinctly remember this time when suddenly I slowly started preferring spending time on the internet rather than going out. So I feel like my generation was sort of this transition generation because that's when all these social media tools like Orkut or Facebook started sort of coming in. But what kind of free
mm,
play would you engage in with the other children that you played with? I'm just curious, like, because would you invent games?
mm.
Would it just be sitting around talking and having social conversations? So I'm curious about how play was structured in that time after school. with the other kids?
There was both a lot of imaginative play. So, we would play house or even older, like as we were older, right? Or we would play whatever, police, fire, whatever. We would make up these imaginary situations. There would be 10 kids. We would make the story along as we were playing. But there was also a lot of games. Like we played Sakli, we played hide and seek. The boys would have their own games. I don't even know what they were called, but we were not allowed, like, they wouldn't allow us to play with them because there was a lot of jumping and, like, physicality. But I also remember playing with like badminton. I remember learning how to cycle and cycling a lot actually in my childhood. I remember the day my mom got me the cycle. My dad got me the cycle as well. It was one of those very funky orange colored cycles, I don't remember we had a lot of imaginative play downstairs, a lot of running. And then I think as I grew older, I came into college, it was more around walking around the building with your friends, chatting, catching up on the day, things like that. We also, at that time, my parents were young, so they would also go out with their friends once in a while. And once I was a bit older, I was allowed to have friends over and have my own little party, whatever that means, So we would play games then, have a little, whatever, cake and chips or whatever, pizza. So yeah, it was a mixture of like structured running games, hide and seek, tag, things like that. But it was also a lot of imaginative play. And we would play the imaginative play not just downstairs, like even at home.
That's so interesting. I remember like when I was hearing you speaking, when we grew up, we had like this apartment complex, so we didn't have a lot of open spaces, but there were two flats in each little block or corner. So we used to make that like
Uh,
we used to call the game boiling water and ice. So whenever you were inside these four corners, nobody could tab you or like tag you. But as soon as you ran out, you could be caught. There was another game I
mm,
think we made where the staircase sort of became like a spaceship and we gave, different
mm,
people different roles. I also started thinking we used to navigate these social and gender constructs and identities and I mean, at least introduce to them and understand them in these social interactions while we
yeah.
were playing as well. And I found that quite intriguing how the older kids would treat the younger kids, how we would look at the other genders and socialize with them and understand identities. And, a lot of our hobbies were also influenced by what the other kids in our neighborhood were sort of doing. But you mentioned that bit about being an avid reader, Purvi. I'm curious, like, do you have an early recollection of the first books that you really enjoyed reading? And were there readers around you? This is for parents or
Mm,
other people listening in, or friends or colleagues. Because I don't think that it is just a sudden switch where you just become a reader. I feel like there's
mm.
there's so many influences, and as an educator, like understand that. So I'm just curious, like if you could briefly give me just like an overview of what were some of those other influences that maybe got you excited about reading at that.
I'm thinking. None of my friends really read, to be honest. I do remember my closest friend growing up used to go to Bombay Scottish, which was considered a very, very good school. It was one of the few ICSE schools at that time. And I always felt that she spoke better than I did. It may not have been true, but I always had this sort of knowledge complex that she knows more because they studied Shakespeare and they studied all these, William Wordsworth and all these poets. But that didn't really, it wasn't that. I don't know, I was just interested. It's not that my mom or my dad reads the newspaper a lot every day. My grandfather reads the newspaper. My grandfather read a lot. He would read Gujarati books mostly. But I also think it might be genetic because when I grew older, I remember once one Diwali, I was at my grandfather's house and I have four aunts who grew up there. And I found this attic. Abhishek, it was like a treasure box. I'd never found this attic before. And I opened it, and there were about 200 books there, by, I don't know, just books from that my aunts must have read when they were growing up, Charlotte Bronte and all of these people. That was it. So maybe it's just genetic. Maybe my aunt's love for reading has come down to me, or maybe I just feel like it's an innate interest that I had. I did join a library that was close to my house. My mom made me join a library. And that was the first thing that I did independently. I would go out of the walk to the library. It was a good 20-minute walk on the main road. I would spend good 45 minutes selecting my next book and then come back. And, it was great. I loved that time. And of course, my first recollections, like all people my age, is Enid Blyton. I think I've read every single book that she has ever written, every series. My favorite book is still The Magic Faraway Tree, and I'm very excited they're making a movie about it, so I can introduce Ian to it. But yeah, I read a lot. I do feel now that I'm reading to Zian that there were many American authors that were really good that I was never exposed to. Like, I never read Percy Jackson and I never read any of those Curious George. I don't know if he's American or British, but the classics that were considered classics now, I didn't read them growing up. So I'm discovering them now for the first time with my son. But yes, I was a huge Enid Blyton fan. I got a lot of books for birthday gifts, from friends and family.
Yeah, I love that, Purvi. And even that, like in a city like Mumbai, even though we live in a metro, sometimes it's hard to access a large variety of books because we don't have a widely spread, easily accessible public library system that you may
Mm,
take for granted in North America. Because when I was based in Canada, I lived close to a community center, and whenever I needed a book, it was so easily accessible. If I needed a book, I could order it and then it would come in from the other libraries. And I always wonder, I wish it would be so nice. There is a degree of privilege in terms of access to books as well, right? And I don't think it should be based on,
mm.
I mean, if a young child wants to read a book, we should create environments where they have a wide variety of literature that is age appropriate in those different languages. I do know that is a struggle. Is that something you have been able to navigate now as a parent here in Bombay?
100%. Yes. There is a lot more exposure now, a lot more availability. I have a system. So if I like a book or I find something interesting, I'll usually go on YouTube and first, like, somebody must have read it aloud. So I'll just go and read it, like listen to the read aloud, or I'll skim through it. And 99.9% of them are available on Amazon. So I'll just buy them. Sometimes even if they're not available in India, you can still order them for the exact same price as you would get it overseas. Sometimes it's cheaper. I also go to some of these books by the kilo, like butterfly books. That's a fantastic find, by the way, for parents who are looking to buy, gently used books for very like reasonable prices. You can buy a kilo of books for 2 to 800 rupees. It's unheard of. And through that, I've taken Zian also with him, so I've let him choose his own books. Sorry, Z with me, and let him choose his own books. I love it. I mean, I think I'm more interested in children's books now than he is, because there's just a book on everything. I've also found that it's the easiest way to get him to accept something that he may not accept from me if I'm lecturing him about it. Like, for example, how to not talk to a stranger. It's easier if I just buy a good book and read it to him. He'll get the message rather than me telling him. Or, for example, my son has ADHD. I'm quite open about it. So, finding books about how their brains are different, or what neurodiversity means, or how everybody's brain is wired different, it's just easier through the books. Or even to talk about, like, the fact that he's adopted, right? I mean, he knows it, but like getting stories about animals who adopt other animals, like all of these things, I think books have really helped us a lot in our household.
I love that. And I think stories have this power to, I don't know, for some reason I've noticed humans naturally tend to
Mm.
open up a little more when things are told to them in the form of a story that is relevant and contextual and age appropriate as well. So, I wanted to go back, Purvi, to your journey. You mentioned this little bit about, struggling with math, and because you have a PhD in science education, that fact was quite interesting to me. But I'm just curious, what was your relationship to the basic sciences and math in that high school phase? Did you study the sciences? Here in India, most students have to choose a specialization after 10th grade, especially if you go to the state board schools or the national boards like ICSE or CBSE. So what was your experience in that junior college, high school phase? And what did you
Mm.
study at that point, and what was your experience in that time?
So I think my favorite subject in school was geography, which is a kind of science if you think about it. I really enjoyed learning about those aspects of science and bio. It was a very default selection, honestly, Abhishek. I was never interested in commerce because of the math aspect, and it's just those things are boring to me. But I feel if I had to do it all over again, if I had a chance, I would have selected the arts because I feel like that aspect of human nature, like sociology and psychology and human history and all of that interests me far more than the hard sciences do. I did study science in 11th and 12th because I did well on my 10th standard exam, and that was the default choice. It was okay. I didn't really enjoy it. I was just having a good time in 11th and 12th. I was in Ruya College. I didn't do very well in 12th, but I was at that time, I was very clear I wanted to go into hotel management and catering. I did not get into the catering college, which was the only college I wanted to go to. And so during my interview, they said I could reapply if I had a BSc. So I said, okay, I'll do a BSc. And I went to, the college was more important to me than the subject. So I only wanted to go to Xavier's College. So I applied for microbiology. And I can tell you that was a great decision because the microbiology department at Xavier's at that time, headed by Vivian Amonkar, Dr. Vivian Amonkar, it was just fantastic. I mean, I had great teachers. I remember I had an interview to get into Xavier's and she said, could you name three microorganisms? And I said, no. I don't know how I got in, but I did something, I loved it. I learned so much. It opened up a whole new world. I made fantastic friends. I loved the college experience. And then I wanted to go abroad, but I always wanted to teach. So by that time, I realized I don't want to do catering. Even at Xavier's, like I would be teaching a little bit here and there. We had an honors program. It always appealed to me. I have been like tutoring kids since I was in 12th standard on and off. So it's always been a part of me. So I decided that I would either do a B.Ed after that or I would go abroad and study education. And then my parents said, no, 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 if you want to go abroad, you have to do science, you have to get your master's. So I did that. I got my master's in microbiology and genetics. It was a piece of cake because the training that we got here in the 3 years that I did my bachelor's it was equivalent to my entire master's theory classes. And so that also gave me an opportunity to pick really difficult and interesting electives like in the medical school and, things that I would have never got a chance to otherwise explore. And then I switched. Once I got my master's, I fulfilled what my parents wanted me to do. I switched and I to the PhD in education. And even then, I only wanted to go to New York. Like I refused to do it if I didn't get in anywhere else. But I got in. And so that's been my journey. And luckily, to get into the PhD program, for science education in Columbia, you have to have a master's in science. So that worked out for me as well. So I feel like I've been a bit lucky in the choices that I made. I've enjoyed everything that I've learned. I've enjoyed a few things more than others, but I've enjoyed everything because bio is one of my favorite sciences now, other than geography. Evolution is my favorite topic.
And I love that story about having great teachers at the undergraduate level and how that can really, shape your career direction in so many ways, and because I wonder if that was not the
Yeah.
case, would you have gone back to hotel management? And it's such a I sometimes it's funny how your life turns out, your plan earlier and what you end up doing. And, your reasoning behind doing the BSc was wanting to get into hotel management, but eventually you went down a more academic and practice, sort of path. But I'm curious about the time you spent at Xavier's at your master's program and your PhD program. If you can tell me, I mean, you've briefly told me about your undergraduate program, but I like the part when you mentioned in your master's program, you were comfortable with the theories or some of the classes. So you took electives if in like other areas as well. So what was that experience like? You studied at Rutgers? Purvi, am I saying
At,
that?
yeah, Rutgers University, New
Rutgers.
Jersey.
So perfect. So can you tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about that college experience at the master's level at Rutgers, and then maybe what did you study in your PhD, and what was that entire process like as a PhD student as well?
Okay, so at Rutgers, I'll tell you the best class I ever took. There were two at Rutgers, and they were not from my department. One was in the medical school, and what the professor would do, I took that class twice because you could take it as many times as you wanted. He would assign us a random paper every week, peer reviewed scientific paper. It could be from any field of science in the biosciences. We had 1 week to read that paper and to come back and teach it to the class without using any presentation video, just the blackboard. And he would record us, and then we had to look at our recording, and then we had to grade ourselves. And it was a very, very difficult class because you don't know what paper you would get. I remember once I was assigned a paper, I didn't know a single word in the abstract. So I had to look it up. But I think it was that teaching aspect that appealed to me, that, okay, I have to understand this so well because I have to go back and teach it to my entire class. So that was a fantastic way to get graduate students excited about research, learn how to read research papers, and then come back and summarize it. Um, that class I took twice, and the second class that I took was from the nutrition. It was from the ecology department, and that was a class that it was called risk assessment, and it was so random. It basically taught us how to assess environmental risks that exist in society, and then how do you prepare for them, and then what risks are sort of over assessed and what risks are under assessed. And then we had to study risk, what do you call them, risk fighting systems. Like, for example, if New York City had a tsunami, what is the system in place, to address it, and then rank it and critique it. And it was super fantastic class. So Rutgers was great. Rutgers is generally known as a party college, to be honest, on the east coast of America. And it was, I took 3 years to get my master's, which is usually a 2 year program. But it has a huge Indian community as well. And so I was president of the Indian club. So I knew like everyone. I had a lot of friends. I stayed on campus. I generally traveled a lot. I went to a few conferences. And my thesis was in food microbiology. So it was funded by the army, actually. They have these beef jerkies that are so dry and are resistant to contamination, so that the soldiers can carry them to places like Iraq where it's really hot, and they won't spoil. And so we were studying what is the risk of them getting contaminated. So it was a very pure microbiology sort of a thesis. My PI, my mentor, was Dr. Schaffner. He is sort of a guru in hand washing. In fact, during COVID, he became really, really famous because he has published all this research saying that hair, those air dryers that you get in the are pretty much useless. We should never use them. In fact, they increase the number of bacteria on your hands rather than cleaning them. So he was very laid back. It was a really good lab. Every 2 weeks he would take all his students out. He was just generally a nice guy. And I met my husband at Rutgers. So, that was also really nice. My PhD experience was very, very different because there is no campus. The campus is the city. New York is your campus. Teachers College is a very old building. It's very dilapidated. There's no AC. Everything's falling. I mean, it's kind of old and historic. I struck gold in the mentor that I found. Her name is Angela Calabrese Barton. I think she has influenced me more than any other mentor in my life in terms of how I look at education. I was a complete novice in the field of education. I still remember the first class I took ever in this college. I was sitting next to now my friend. She's South Korean, Mion. And somebody said Piaget, and I turned to her and I said, "What's a Piaget?" And she said, no, it's who's Piaget. So I was really, I took a whole semester of classes on voice, and I couldn't understand what is this voice. Everybody keeps talking about voice. So I was a complete novice, and I learned everything that I've learned. I feel like I've learned over there. This is also where my science came in because I couldn't afford, I had to find jobs on campus that would pay for credits. And so I worked in a frog neuroscience lab where I had to study the mating habits of frogs and then dissect them. And it was very fun. And then I also got an internship to help children with partial cerebral palsy. So they would come in for the summer, and then you would do certain exercises with them, and then you would measure if that is helping them. So I got all these opportunities because of my science background, and that helped me pay through, for a lot of the credits that I took. My PhD thesis was about teaching science for social justice. That was what my advisor, that's her whole thing about social justice. And it was, I did 5 case studies on teachers. I followed them through their second year of grad school and their first year of teaching. So I studied how their thoughts around their own identities as socially just educators, whether that evolved or not, and how that was connected to the experiences that they had as novice teachers when they entered the city's most difficult classrooms. A lot of them taught in the Bronx or in East Harlem, where I also taught, or, in difficult neighborhoods. All of them were white, and the schools and all of them were upper middle class, if we can call them that, but none of their kids were, or most of their kids were not. And so how they navigated though that first difficult year of teaching, how that shaped their identity, how that shaped their own view of their own agency to bring about change, and what is the discourse between identity and agency in terms of being a socially just educator. That was what it was mostly theory forming. It was like forming theory. It was very qualitative, very, very qualitative. Yeah, that's what my thesis was.
I love that. I think that could be such a great documentary, Purvi, in terms of following their journeys, because
Yeah.
I mean, that's such an important time in a teacher's life when they move out of teacher's college and go into the classroom, because that's when, the theory practice sort of balance really goes out. You really understand what the realities of the classroom are, how much of the theory is applicable. And yeah, and I like how you mentioned that the identity pieces, they come into play so importantly in that setting, right? Like your own background, the students that you are teaching, how that interplay sort of happens, and what does it mean to be like a socially just. But I'm curious about, like, in your mind, did you think you wanted to get into academia, or because your thesis was also qualitative but also practice based in terms of observing, do you think that was sort of a factor in pushing you? I know you mentioned that you were already curious about teaching, but because you were so embedded in academia by this time, did you think you'd move down that academic path, or you knew you were going to transition into teaching, or were there other factors influencing your
Mm.
thinking too?
I tried to get an academic job. So while I was doing my thesis, I also taught at Hunter College, which is like a city college in New York. I taught undergrads there for 2 semesters, and it was an open, like the person who hired me said, teach whatever you want, sort of in the field of education. I loved that. And I was always a TA, even during my master's, I was a TA for all 3 years. During my PhD, also, I was a TA with my advisor. So I think somewhere I knew that I didn't want a job where it was all about research and then getting grant funding, and that doesn't excite me. I wanted to be with people, in front of people. I know I was good at teaching. I knew that. So when this opportunity came to me to teach in a public school, I just jumped at it. I didn't have my teaching certificate. So I actually was a substitute teacher. I was hired as a substitute teacher, permanent substitute teacher. So if I missed a day of school, I wouldn't get paid for that day, basically. That's how it was. But the idea was that while I do that for a year, I also take my certification exam and get the New York teaching certificate. It worked out because there were 3 teachers in that school from my program at Teachers College. All 3 of us got our PhDs and decided to teach there. And it was like a little community that I already knew. It was just a middle school, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. It was a very destabilized middle school because they had seen a leadership change multiple times, so in a very short span. It was in an area where there were 2 major gangs who would recruit in 8th grade. It was a mostly Hispanic neighborhood, mostly Puerto Rican, a few black kids, but mostly Puerto Rican. And my principal who hired me was unbelievable. I remember the first day she took me for a walk around the school, and the first person she introduced me to was the janitor. And the second person she introduced me to was like the other housekeeping people. And then she took me to the classrooms, and I just loved her. She didn't believe in like disciplining kids, even though it was a really tough environment. I think her love for the kids and just her warmth changed a lot. Many of the teachers who were there when I left are still there. So I think that's also a testament to it was a public school. So I think I knew, and once the first day of my teaching, when I entered the classroom, I just knew this was it. This is like the career that, it was a tough year, but it was a great year, a lot of learning. I cried a lot on my last day when I left.
And like, what were some of the findings from your thesis, your PhD thesis, Purvi, in terms of how do you think with those 5 case studies, like what were some, if you don't mind sharing, because I'm really curious what you noticed while you were doing, and how long was that PhD program as well?
I don't remember exactly what I found. It was 5 years.
Yeah.
It took me 5.5 years to complete. Basically, what we found was that the first finding was that there is a very strong correlation between your identity and your agency. as a first year teacher, which means that whatever you're thrown into in that first year of teaching, right? How much do you take on yourself to change what needs to be changed within your circle of control? Directly influences what you, it's not, it doesn't sound like rocket science now, but at that time it was like directly influences how you think of yourself, whether you think you're capable of teaching in this manner, and also whether you see yourself as somebody who's just going in to teach science, or you see yourself as somebody who's going in to teach science to a particular group of kids who come with their own narratives, their own histories, their own understandings of science, of their own definitions of what science means, and are you willing to incorporate that into your teaching? That was a big thing. The second thing was this idea of funds of knowledge. So funds of knowledge was this, it's like, when we go to our farm, our farmers who don't speak English, they have their own vocabulary for measuring land. Like they say ek koti, like I don't know, they use certain jargon. They have their own measurements. That doesn't not make it science, right? So just because it doesn't fall in the definition of Western science doesn't make it non-science. And so also for it was interesting for me to see how, and this was all theory we had learned, so the teachers should have been taking this and looking for the funds of knowledge that exist in their students' homes, that exist in their students' minds, a lot of them, and the teachers were able to keep that at the forefront, and not look at this as I'm here to give you, I'm here to enlighten you, I'm here to rescue you, I'm here to look at me like I'm doing such a good job, but rather I'm here to understand you and learn from you what you already know and incorporate that into this formal way of teaching and learning science so that you can make more sense of it. I think those were the teachers who probably saw themselves as more socially just educators. I know I'm talking like in a long, winding way, but it's been so many years. But for me, that was the big thing. I think one of the recommendations that came out from the thesis was in our science education program, Teachers College, not the PhD, the master's program where teachers get certified. Teaching for social justice and urban science education should be compulsory subjects because the realities are very different from a person. Most of the students who come to Teachers College to get their master's degree are not in this demographic. They are from the suburbs, they are middle class, they are kind of rich, they are white, they've led a sort of secluded life. And so, how do you understand the realities of the kids you're going to teach? And so, we felt like we should definitely make these subjects or these classes mandatory for all to take, along with things like methods and things like that, which they take, and learning about pedagogy of science and all of that. But honestly, I don't remember much because it was a very theoretical. It wasn't like there were like boom, boom, boom. These were the, yeah, sorry.
No, but
So sorry. That made no sense.
no, it did, Purvi. It was so, I mean, that funds of knowledge thing was so relevant. And, as a classroom teacher, it got me thinking when I was doing my training, I was
Mm.
at a school in London, Ontario, and we were very close to the indigenous communities that lived around the school. And, they would come in, and it was really tricky for me as a trainee teacher to understand, the background, the context in that situation, to be respectful, to realize that there's a history that you have to be very mindful of, and not just jump into it as experts, right? And I think that funds of knowledge piece was so important because I was teaching English in a public school, and there's a history with public school teaching and the indigenous communities in Canada that's not very nice. It's very dark, right? So there was a lot of tension I had to navigate, and I found it really difficult to understand because I was trying to become competent as a teacher, but also
Mm.
I had to be respectful of the nature of the relationship in that particular school environment, because the teacher that was working with me was also very experienced. There was this one situation I remember where the national anthem was playing, and one of the kids said they didn't want to stand up, and the I think my teacher, we had a conversation about this later on, and she told me, like, what did you think about that? And I told her I wasn't sure because I was just nervous. When you're teaching as a substitute, you're just a nervous wreck, and I was like, I'm not sure, like, but I do think that there's a history to why they made that decision. And my first impulse would be to, rather than push, because with if you immediately go into that situation to discipline, right, you can completely cut off the person, and the teacher that I was working with was respectful of that choice, and she told me that she was comfortable with her patriotism and understood the nature of why that was happening, and there was
Mm.
another situation where I think this was one of the conversations that really stayed with me, and I feel like I still don't completely understand it. But she told me that when she became a parent, this was, I think, in my second or third like teaching assignment. But she said that when she became a parent, she realized that every student is someone's baby. When she said that, because I was not a parent myself, something changed in how I looked at these classrooms. If this was my child, how would I navigate this situation? And these are all someone's children, so it just developed a sense of patience and empathy to understand that everyone comes with their own strengths, and you have to find a way to work with that. And it also made me realize that there are so many challenges that classroom teachers face. Like in that situation, it was 20 children. I can't imagine in the classroom that you were in, you know, that even I was in. I had 50 kids in my classroom. You said there were 60. So it's amazing what teachers are able to do in these classroom settings, how they're able to deliver the curriculum, build relationships. I think teaching is just such a complex, thankless job, but it's also one of those jobs where you have this opportunity to have such a long-term impact on someone's sort of life. So I'd love to read, if you do have access to like a PDF of your thesis, Purvi, somewhere, if you could send that to me, I would really enjoy like reading it, like picking your brain. But this is just the curiosity sort of thing in the side. But like, I know once you were done with your PhD, Purvi, like you did teach for a while, but you moved back to India, and you the role you had was of a school leader at the Akanksha Foundation. I'm just curious about what was your experience, because you moved into that role of a school leader after like a year or a little more than a year in the classroom, right, as a teacher. So was that challenging for you, and what was different about teaching in a classroom here in Mumbai? And maybe just tell me, what do you remember of that time? I think it was 4 years, if I'm not wrong. 4 3.
I was there for 3.5, 4 years.
Got it. So if you can just tell me what you remember and what you learned about education
Yeah,
during that time as well.
I learned a lot. It was different. Uh, I was in an inner city school, right, in Manhattan. I was in one of the poorest parts of the city, and our school was resource constrained. Our kids were coming from either single parent family. Most all of our kids were on free lunch. All of them. That's the measure for how much money a school has. When I came back and I saw our and like first of all, when I got this job, it was unbelievable to me, right? Because I'd come back from the US with stars in my eyes, like social justice educator. I want to change. You know how 20-year-olds are, 30-year-olds are. And this job fell in my lap. They said, okay, we are starting the school. We want someone to lead it. I couldn't believe my luck. And I'm very, very thankful to, Shaheen who hired me and the Akanksha Foundation who hired me. I didn't realize how different the definition of resource constraint is just in two different countries. I mean, over there, we were in a constrained school, but I had my own printer in my classroom. It was very different here. Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. When we started the school, there was already kindergarten running there as an Akanksha center. And those children were now moving to grade one. And it was one of the Mumbai public schools are these English medium schools that the government started. And before that, there were very few English medium schools before this whole MPS movement. And so they didn't have enough teachers. They wanted the kids to move because they wanted to, set up the school and have a MPS over there in Kala Chowki. And since Akanksha was already there, they sort of approached the MCGM for a public-private partnership, and it worked out. So we just continued with the students that we had in first grade. There were many, many, many lessons that I learned. I honestly, I wouldn't say it was difficult. I mean, I just think everything was exciting. Everything was new. It was new for the organization. It was new for me. It was new for every teacher we hired. I remember when we started the school, we went into the Kala Chowki community for days, and we would go to the Chauraha and we would put up a, little flyer saying, Naya school shuru ho raha hai, please come. Parents came. We had some admissions, but they were mostly kids who were coming in. And by the second year, the line for admissions, it was, like 5 baje se hum khade hai line mein. It was that the cooperator was putting pressure on us to give him seats so that he could give it to people whom he knew, things like that. It wasn't, but I learned a lot of lessons. I think in retrospect, I learned more lessons than when I was there. I think the most important lesson that I learned was that everything is about culture in a school, in any organization, but in a school. And this is my, I mean, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think it's my favorite quote because it just is true. Um, and this is also something that Shaheen herself believed in, and she would say it a lot. And not just it. It was very important that we set the right culture with the teachers. That they feel empowered, they feel that they have autonomy, they feel that they have creativity, and only then will that carry back to the kids. And the second thing that I learned was that it was very important for me to be clear about what I wanted to achieve, like what the vision of my school was, because everything and anything is possible. You can put anything as your vision. So I needed to have a lot of clarity on what I wanted. And for me, it was always about agency because that was my background. And we just talked about that. So for me, it was about critical thinking and agency. That's all I wanted my kids to develop and to not feel helpless when they graduate, that they should be able to navigate in the world on their own. And so everything we did, every single thing, whether it was curriculum choices, using the textbook, activities, pedagogy, parent events, student events, everything was decided by that one goal. We never made a decision that didn't align to that goal. And I learned that actually by visiting a school called Riverside, which is in Ahmedabad, which is run by Kiran Sethi. She used to be invited over to talk to us and, sort of encourage us and motivate us. And, she is so clear about her vision and how everything is aligned there. And so I felt like that was useful. Also, I had a great team of teachers. We were very selective in the teachers we took. We would not afraid to let teachers go. Yeah. So I think culture, clarity as a leader. I'm talking about as a school leader, if somebody asks. And the third thing was this whole experiential learning because I had just come back from teaching a year in New York where we did Urban Advantage. And I was very clear that kids cannot learn in the classroom. And so all of and we were only one junior KG, one senior KG, one grade one, one grade two, not a big school. The kids would be out every week. They would be going somewhere. So when they studied about water systems, they went to the water, sanitation plant. They did a whole walk of that. We did, we did a lot of stuff. They went to the zoo like 25 times to study animal morphology, all of this stuff. They went to a dietitian. I remember one time we had goats in our classroom, parrots in our classroom, because the community was right there and parents were happy to bring it in. We wanted to do a unit on measurement, and one of our kids' dads, talking about funds of knowledge, one of my kids' dads was a carpenter, and one of them was a banana seller. And so we brought them in and they taught them what measurement means, money. So that was my vision for the school. And when I left, that batch was moving to fourth grade. And also the school was expanding because they couldn't, like, we needed two divisions and things like that. I'm still in touch with that first, second batch of kids. They're all doing really well. In fact, I'm even in touch with a couple of my kids from the US school, believe it or not, even though I only taught them for a year. Yeah. So I definitely learned a lot. And I feel like I haven't, but when I'm standing in front of teachers and leaders and delivering a session, then all of these anecdotes and learnings come back, right, in the moment. That's when I realized, like, oh my God, those 3.5 years taught me a lot.
Yeah, I'm so amazed how much you were able to pack into, such a like that time period, Purvi, whether it was finishing your master's, doing your PhD, working in that inner city school in New York, then coming back 3.5 years working as a school leader. And, it's so, I completely, because I've spent some time in the classroom, I completely understand how hard it is to do some of the experiential things that you were saying. There are so many logistical challenges that you have to navigate to actually bring that to life. It's very easy to say, but to do that, especially in a city like Mumbai, with getting the buses, getting parent permissions, getting all the kids on board, working with the teacher, bringing in that curricular alignment. I mean, the fact that you were able to build that as a culture piece, I think that is so powerful. Like even what you were saying, like for my master's, Purvi, when I did my master's in education administration. So my master's thesis was basically what I did was I analyzed the mission statement of 100 CBSE schools, and I did a qualitative analysis of patterns that I saw in the mission statements of these. And it was at that time when the CBSE boards were trying to push out like a mandatory requirement for all CBSE schools to, I think it was 2016 or so, to release like a mission statement that would guide all their work. And it was so interesting to observe how schools chose certain statements, what they decided to put, what they decided to, value, and how that. And because I spent a lot of time on school websites and I went to a CBSE school myself, you could see the alignment in terms of what was actually practiced and what was actually trickled down. And I find that insight that you shared about culture eating strategy is so crucial, especially in the role of a school leader, because you are guiding the entire team. And, the teachers can face several challenges, but if the school leader is clear about what that outcome is, I think you can really help teachers on the ground, not get too stressed about the daily challenges that you will face in any classroom. And I think over here, because it was a public private partnership, I'm sure like you also saw a lot of your research come alive, in terms of how can you be a socially just educator, because students come from different backgrounds. And I love that story of how you integrated the parents in the classroom for a lesson like measurement, because you are tapping into the knowledge systems that are already present rather than coming into it thinking that we know what the best curriculum is and we are going to push that onto these. I feel like I could listen to you talk about stories from that period, for a long time. But post that, Purvi, from under resourced, you went to one of the more
Yeah.
well resourced, maybe probably one of the best resourced schools, in a setting in India, right? So I'm curious about what was that transition like for you, because you were teaching at the American School of Bombay, but your role was as a service learning leader. And if you could just tell me about that period and what was your experience as a teacher and service learning. I know there was a specific title you had over there, which was also very, and Rohit, who I also interviewed on the podcast, was also in that role. And so, yeah, small world, but can you tell me about that period at that school?
Just before I get into that, I want to tell you an incident about, because you're being so generous. Let me also tell you a hard lesson I learned where I did go in thinking that I knew better than the parent community and how it backfired. So we were having a holy celebration in our school in the first year, and everyone was super excited. And we have a large Muslim community in that school, and a lot of parents came and basically said we don't want our kids to play holy, it's against our religion and whatever, all of this stuff. And I was very I don't know what is the word, arrogant, I guess. And I said, what do you mean? Like, we're a secular school. We celebrate all religions. We also celebrate Eid. And, how can you come here? And it was not pleasant, the exchange that we had. And I was coming from a very morally high sort of ground, trying to teach them that, oh, you're not secular. It backfired quite badly as a principal. And I had to take a step back and really reflect at that time that why am I forcing my views about something on someone else? This is clearly something they care about. And so we had to have a lot of parent meetings after that, where we had to put our point of view in front of them and get them to talk about, do they accept or not accept. And finally, the conclusion that we came to was that, okay, you can have these events and our kids will come, but if they say we don't want to play, please don't force them. And I thought that was a good middle ground. The parents didn't stop their kids from coming, but at the same time, we kind of gave them also, we let them express their own agency, I guess, in terms of whether they wanted to. So I always, that incident has stayed with me because I feel like I really thought I was right at that time in the way I handled it. I think moving to ASB, it was very different. I learned a lot over there. So my title was service coordinator. And so what I had to do was, there was no service department or service program. There was a teacher who was trying to work with other middle school teachers to do something because it's part of ASB's mission, but they wanted to formalize it. And so my job in that first year was to sort of set this up. And once again, I got very lucky with who my supervisor was, and that was Madeline. And to this date, I feel very, very grateful to her. Actually, all of these women who have come into my life, like, and it's all been women, like, they've really influenced me a great deal. I felt like she came with a lot of humility and empathy, but and also sort of an understanding of how the international school system works, and she took me under her wing. It wasn't easy to work at ASB. I was very conscious of the fact that I was Indian, surprisingly, over there. I don't think the teachers ever did anything to make me feel that way, but I found it much easier to work with middle school because I love middle school. I've taught middle school. I connect with middle school teachers. I used to sit in the middle on the middle school floor and to work with the elementary school teachers. I found it very, very difficult to work with the high school teachers. I don't know why. I just found it difficult. Anyway, so I did that I thought that by the second or third year, the program was in a very good place because the three sections, the elementary, the middle, and the high school, had very distinct programs that were age appropriate. In the third year, but I wasn't very happy because there's no opportunity to move in this role. You just keep doing the same thing over and over again and keep improving on the systems. And there was a separate CAS coordinator at that time. I think after Rohit left, they combined the two roles, which makes a lot of sense. And so I'm like a kangaroo. My husband always says I can't stay in one place for too long. So I was also getting a little bit like, okay, what's the learning here? I've done this. I've presented at a conference. What else can I do? And that's when Fiona joined. She was the middle school principal. Again, I love her. I think she was a great principal. And she gave me the opportunity to co-teach seventh grade science. I was substituting once in a while at the school, and I co-taught two batches of seventh grade that year with two very, very different co-teachers, like poles apart. And that taught me a lot as well because they were set. They had been in that school for years. I was the new teacher, and I had to manage both their styles and change my style when I was with each one. And I had to try and find my voice because I don't know why, but I did feel a little bit like, how can I say this? Should I make this suggestion? Should I do it this way? ASB is so different. I couldn't figure out like what would click and what wouldn't click and what would work. So that was a big personal learning in terms of how to advocate for myself and speak up for myself in a place where I was not the majority. I was in the minority in that sense. And then I joined the MSLT, which was the middle school leadership team as well. They gave me an opportunity, which was a lot of learning because that year we had an audit for the school by the IB board or whatever, the IB group. And I learned a lot about how that process works, how they do the audit, who they meet. And that has also helped me in my business because now we can go to schools. I've been on the other side, right? So I can work with leaders to help them sort of audit their own school and be fair about it and things like that. So there were many learnings. The biggest learning, however, was not educational, it was logistical because I have never worked in an organization where logistics and operations are that important. I mean, I had to work with the bus department, I had to work with every department, the canteen, when kids went on field trips and things like that. I didn't realize how seriously they take physical safety because when I was at Akanksha, we would just pack kids in taxis and they would go. We wouldn't even think twice, But here, we had to do a recce. We had to figure out if it was safe. We had to get, a lot of kids had allergies, so we had to get all of that. So it really gave me a perspective on how deeply to think about safety and logistics and operations so things don't go badly. So that was a big learning for me. I don't enjoy that part of the job. That part of it has to be done. And I feel like now I can better guide somebody because I went through it for 3 years for myself, so I'm far more cognizant of the details when it comes to planning something. Yeah. I left ASB because I was not teaching in the last year that I was there and I really wanted to teach. I didn't want to do this. I felt like the service department was running fine and whoever came in, it needed fresh eyes, which Rohit brought and, fresh ideas, which he brought. So I'm really glad that transition happened.
And I think we briefly met at that point as well, Purvi. I remember like a brief conversation I had with you about, I think at that time I was interested. I was much younger. I was working with another department at the school as a research associate. And it was so interesting that a school had a research department. And I was doing my master's and I got this internship that became a job later on. And I was always so intrigued by what you were doing, but I completely am able to slightly understand and empathize what you mean when sometimes you feel out of place because of who you are and where you come from. And it's surprising that you say that because you had so much experience, you were a school leader, or you did your PhD in science education. But yeah, international schools are different, beasts. And it's amazing to see how systems and processes are so set in place. And, you have roles that are sort of very specialized, like in ways that are so different to what you would. Again, I think I taught at an international school in Canada for 2 years. I taught grade 5 and it was an IB school and much smaller than ASP, but we had classroom sizes of 15 students, 16 students, so much more one-to-one time. We had resource people that could assist us when a student needed the additional support, and they were well paid and they were trained in that particular sort of area of need, right? So we had a lot of support. But then when I was in the public school system, again, it was different, larger numbers, and sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around this when you look at it from a macro perspective. And sometimes you also wonder, like, and that was like something I struggled with when I moved into the classroom. Like, and the other challenging piece was, even though I was working in an international school, I was still being paid much lesser than a lot of my colleagues and I spent like a lot of time training for this role, but I was still being not. So for me, this is just like a personal sort of like, sharing with you, Purvi. Like, I struggled a lot with this in terms of, and then I was going through a lot of other personal challenges at that time too, with family, with immigration and stuff like that. But I love the classroom, but there's so much that the job asks of you as a teacher. And it's not just I love the teaching and the curriculum piece, but it's the emotional and financial pieces that sometimes it's hard to explain to other people that don't do the very same thing, and I think it changes drastically across context and countries, So I am so amazed how you were able to move from that school in Manhattan to being a school leader in Akanksha to taking up this new role in this international school and then moving into co-teaching. I think it requires a lot of humility and relearning, right? To move between those spaces. Now, Purvi, I wanted to talk about the most recent project, which is Renaissance Education. I hope I'm saying that right. Am I saying that right, Purvi?
Yeah, yeah, Renaissance, you're right.
Perfect. So I know that's something you were working on towards the later part of your time at ASB, and project-based learning was something you were always passionate about. But if you could briefly, tell me about the vision of Renaissance Education and some of your initiatives, especially City as a Lab, that is this amazing project that I wish I was part of as a student. But if I do have parents, I always recommend your work to them. So yeah, like
Thank you.
about Renaissance and your work there.
Yeah, Renaissance Education is a consulting firm, and we didn't really start it with that vision in mind. We just said that, okay, I'm moving out of my role at ASB. My partner Sangeeta at that time was still in the Akanksha Foundation. She was moving out of her role. And we said, let's just do something. We both are interested in PBL and experiential learning. She is a science teacher also. So we said, okay, let's start having some workshops for children. Let's set up a company where we sell one of, those kits, science kits with some online thing. Then we did a workshop at Kala Ghora Festival. We did some birthdays. We dabbled in all of this stuff. We actually did a lot of workshops with kids. We did a lot of workshops at ASB also as part of their after school program. We did a workshop where kids had to make toys using waste and then explain the science behind them. A lot of fun things. And that went on for a year and a half. And then we felt like that wasn't having enough impact. Like, these kids come here for fun, and what are they taking away? That's when we decided that it's best to work with teachers, because if we work with one teacher, we can influence a lot of kids and we can change the way things work inside classrooms. Plus, I'd been a school leader. I enjoyed working with adults. Even in my role at ASB, I was working with the teachers primarily. So, I had that experience. So, I don't know how many times I'm going to say this, but I think life has been very good to me. But serendipitously, there was a company called Exceed. There is a company called Exceed. They make curriculum, and they had a client who had signed them up for a 2-year very deep dive course on school leadership and pedagogy, because they were setting up all these schools and they had nobody to run them. And so Exceed approached me because I had done some PD with them as a participant in the past, and they said, can you do this class called Theories of Learning? We'll give you 4 days. And I said, wow, yeah, definitely. Like, going back to my PhD days, I'll do Vygotsky and Piaget. Now I knew all those terms, right? So we did this 4-day workshop with them, and there were 70 people in that room. That was the time when both Sangeeta and I realized this is what we're meant to do, because it was highly engaging. Those workshops were from 8 in the morning to 8 in the night. They were intense. There was a lot of work, but I don't think anybody was disengaged. Everybody wanted to learn. So we just felt like this was our calling, like we are meant to work with schools and teachers. And after that, because we've been in the education sector for a while, we got We just got clients. So our first official client was this organization called Sterlite Power. Now they're called Sterlite Power. And at that time, I don't know if you know this, but our municipal government has a live classroom like via satellite. So they have a studio in Dadar. There are 4 studios, and you go there and you deliver a lesson that is live, that kids can see on a TV in their classrooms, in all 1,200 classrooms across the city, 1,200 schools. And they can also interact with you because they can ask you questions and things like that. This Sterlite Power were funding the science, math, and English program. So they approached us and they said, can you run this program? So hire the teachers, train them, build the curriculum. So we said, yeah, this is great, Imagine reaching all 1,200 schools. So we did that. That was our first official client. We enjoyed it because we had to take the textbook and align the lessons to the textbook, find the teachers. And also it was weird being in a studio, there are no kids in front of you. You're just talking into the mic. So there were a lot of learnings in that. And then slowly we got more work. We, like you read, when you were introducing me, you said it was born out of a desire to promote learning that is empowering, joyful, and relevant. So we never really had any agenda other than that. So we did not say no to any work that we got. We said yes to everything. So as a result of that, we got very, very different experiences. We worked in Pench, tribal villages in Pench. We have worked on like with a social impact consulting firm on a 6-year early childhood program. We worked with schools, we worked in small cities, we worked in large cities, we worked internationally, we worked with a school in Bangladesh. Because we decided early on we won't say no to everything. Everything adds to our portfolio. We've done a ton of different stuff, and that's been exciting for us and a lot of learning. If you ask me about City as Lab, Abhishek, initially City as Lab was just one of the things we were doing as part of Renaissance. And then it's now it's sort of a not profit thing. It's also been around for 13 years. So Renaissance Education is 13 and City as Lab is 13.
Yeah, and like with City as a Lab, for like someone listening in, if they're a school leader or a teacher and they're interested, like what is the process for someone to sign up for this? And if you could briefly tell us what City as Lab is and how is it different from what kids may experience in a regular school set?
Yeah. So I think City as Lab I have not found another project-based learning platform in India that is similar to ours at this scale. So it's a semester-long project that kids work on in groups with their class school teacher as their mentor. So our model is that we work with the teachers to coach them, to guide them, to mentor them, to train them. We provide rubrics, we provide lesson plans, we provide feedback, but the teacher has to guide the kids in the end. And the kids get to select from one of 6 types of projects. There's a research project, service project, photography, maker or engineering, coding, and story. So they get to select a project, they work on it. It has to be an authentic, original problem or question that they are tackling about the place that they live in. So if they're living in Mumbai, it has to be about Mumbai, or maybe specifically about their neighborhood, like Borivali or Kemps Corner or Mumbai or wherever. If it is in Dahod, then the question is about Dahod. If it is in Ahmedabad, the question is about Ahmedabad. There's no restriction on what question the kids can ask. They can ask whatever appeals to them and whatever is relevant to their community. And they go through the process of collecting the stories or photographing or creating a solution or doing research and then submitting the end product to us. And then we review the end products. It is a blind review in the sense that we are not the ones reviewing it. Somebody who doesn't know the kids is reviewing it, like you reviewed it. The criteria for the review are shared with the schools right from day one. They have the rubrics. And then typically in a good year, we get about 60 projects, 60 to 70 projects. And then we select 10. And we have a conference in March every year in Mumbai, and all the 10 groups come together. They have a presentation. It's like a thesis defense. They get 5 minutes to present, and then there's Q&A. There's a whole audience. There's a panel. And there's no prize. So there's no first, second, third prize. Prize is you get to present. And that's it. They have a day of learning. And that's the whole cycle. It takes a year. So it starts in June and it ends in March of next year. And schools can register. There is a payment, but it's very minimal. Anywhere from 250 rupees a child to 800 rupees a child. It's a sliding scale depending on the school fees. And it's free for government school, NGOs, and other schools below a certain fee. if their fees are below a certain level. So that's the whole. And if you want to see the types of projects, every year we invite panelists to come. We've had some very, very esteemed panelists, and we have to convince them a lot because, it's a Sunday morning, you're giving up. Oh, we're going to go listen to some kids. What's it going to be like? And every single year, the panelists come back and say, thank God I came because I did not expect that level of rigor or that level of ownership, from children who are in sixth, seventh, eighth grade. We didn't know that this was possible. And that's why we love City as Lab, because it continuously proves to adults who don't believe in kids that they can do a lot if you set the bar really high. Yeah. I love City as Lab.
Yeah, and I will be including links to Cities Lab and their website in the show notes as well. So Purvi, just to respect time, this is a question I really wanted to ask you. And
Okay.
I've been reading your homeschooling blog, and
Yeah.
I just love the stories you mentioned with your son Z, and how you are navigating that. I because now you are like in addition to being like an education consultant, you're also an education entrepreneur. Like if you had to plan this out as a career, like the different paths that you took, it would be very hard to structure it as a like in terms of a plan, right? Whether it was teaching in that Manhattan school, to being a school leader for 4 years, to moving into that service role and building Renaissance and Cities Lab over the last 13 years. And now your journey, I think it's such an important part of your identity, as a parent. So what has that like? Do you feel like it feeds into each other, your identity as an educator and as a parent? And how has that changed over the years, that you've been a parent as well? And I'm speaking as someone that has no experience in this field. I'm not a parent myself. So, I have no clue about how beautiful and difficult and the ups and downs of that experience. So I'm really curious from that perspective too.
I recently wrote somewhere, I think on LinkedIn, that I've been an educator for 18 years and a parent for 8. But these last 8 years have taught me much more about being an educator than I ever learned. I am literally on the other side of the table now, right? Where I've been on the principles. The first thing I learned is the power dynamic. I didn't realize, I mean, I always knew because I knew that there's a power dynamic, but I didn't, even with all of my education and my expertise, when I sit across the table from my son's teacher, there is a power dynamic. And there's nothing that anybody can do about it. So I'm far more conscious and empathetic to parents now than I think I ever was in my career as an educator. And I also preach this to all the school leaders that I talk about. What you said, you're teaching somebody's child. I think that has really, I've understood that. Second, I think the confidence to homeschool has definitely come because I feel like I have enough experiences teaching children and I can make learning engaging for my own child. I don't know if I'm delusional, but we'll see. I don't think we're going to homeschool him forever, if I'm being completely honest. We are trying to figure out what is the best environment for Z to learn. It is definitely not a regular school. He struggles, the teachers struggle, the other kids struggle, and it's not a win-win for him. We struggle, but at the same time, he needs structure. He's not the kid who you just, because if I let him just be, he'll be playing the whole day very happily, and that's not a bad thing, but it's not realistic to be doing that. So we took this year off to figure out where he belongs and what's going to serve him. Being in Mumbai is a big plus when you're homeschooling because there's so much available, right? So because Zian has like 1,000 interests, like he wants to do pottery and he wants to drum and he wants to swim and he wants to whatever. He has like so many interests. There's something available for him. I just have to research or ask a WhatsApp group and I find it. And homeschooling gives me the freedom to do that. Every morning, Zian goes to swim with his dad and play badminton, which he would never get to do if he were in a school. So I think I appreciate a lot more parents who choose to homeschool. It is not easy. And you have to be really strong in your conviction of it. And I've met a lot of homeschooling parents already in this journey, and some of them are very different. I'm still very academic because I'm a teacher and I feel like, no, you must sit and let's do an experiment or let's whatever. Like I am that sort. But there are parents who they're like, okay, just follow your interests, do what you want, you learn along the way. And I hugely admire that because I cannot be like that. How has this influenced me as an educator? Very, very, very much. I can see like now where my interests lie in the next few years is to support kids with neurodivergent kids and kids with special needs. In fact, even when I was at ASB, I had to set a personal goal for myself, and Fiona was principal, and that's the goal I had selected to work with English language learners. So I can see how difficult it is for a teacher who has 20, 30 kids in her class and has these two kids who they have to teach differently or interact with differently. It's also difficult for the kids because they don't know any other way to be, so they need what they need. And so I'm very curious to learn more. Let me just tell you, Abhishek, it's very easy to say all this, and it's actually probably easier for me to do it as a teacher than with my own kid. Like, it's really hard teaching your own kid, but still there are things that I'm learning. And I'm also learning the value of the of therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, like how valuable they are. And I'm glad to see that more and more parents are openly talking about their kids' challenges and struggles. Not because there's anything wrong with the kid, but because they're struggling in the system that exists. So this is, I think, the defining moment for me in terms of what the next 10 years of my own learning is going to be. It's definitely going to be around neurodivergence because that's what I'm working with every day.
Yeah, and I think it'll be really exciting to see how you document and archive that experience, Puri, because I do think the way you reflect on your experience, even in the blog, like when you were mentioning the story of Z going swimming, I remember reading the blog post you put up, and there was a line you had where you said that, and it's interesting coming from you as a teacher, right? That your son had to wake up at this horrendous time and go to school. And, like we take a lot of things for granted, when we are so embedded in the system, right? But when you look at
Mhm.
it really from the kid's eyes, and then when you become a parent, I feel like you really empathize with that experiential aspect of what it means to be in a learning environment, right? So I'm very excited about seeing how you navigate this journey, and I hope you
Thank
document
you.
some of your learnings along the way, whether it's with Renaissance, which I think you're doing. I'd love to participate whenever you do have the conference in March, as just to see what the kids are doing, because the project that I got to review, it was just such, I love how rigorous your rubrics are.
Thank you.
I did notice that, and as someone that spent a lot of time designing this, I think the rubric plays such an important role in the kind of learning that can happen, right? So great job on that, Purvi. The last question I wanted to ask you before we close, Purvi, is do you have a recommendation for a children's picture book that you have read that Z has really enjoyed and that you have also enjoyed as a parent? One or two, or even one is fine.
Yes, the first one is What Should Danny Do? I love that book, and it's there are two. There's What Should Danny Do, and then What Should Danny Do in School. And basically, it's 8 stories in one. So at every point in the story, the kid gets to make a choice for what should Danny do, and depending on the choice, different things happen. And so it's very, very, my son loves it because he gets to sometimes make bad choices, sometimes make good choices, and see how it affects the outcome. So that's one recommendation that I have. I don't have a book recommendation, Abhishek, because I love all the books we have, but I want to say something. Like, a lot of parents I have met don't allow their kids to read comics. And I can tell you that I read somewhere that a good comic, can teach your child like some 5 times more vocabulary than they would read in a picture book because of all the onomatopoeia and all of the other things that and I feel like let your kid just read whatever they want to read. That's like my son. I think I wrote a blog, or I think I wrote a LinkedIn post on this. He loves Dogman, like loves. I don't know if you've read Dogman, but and I didn't know that the author of Dogman himself has had dyslexia and ADHD, and so that was really interesting also to know. But if I had to ask him to recommend a book, he would recommend Dogman. Yeah, but What Should Danny Do is the one that comes to my mind immediately. Yeah, there are so many, Abhishek. There are so many.
I hope you write a post about some of the books that you think
Maybe.
are, because I think that would be really, I think I did read maybe in one of your LinkedIn posts some recommendations you may have put, but I think that would be really helpful to other parents because I think
Yeah.
you only will know what is enjoyable based on what, and because you're reading them out loud, I think you will have a good grasp on it in terms of what, and I completely relate to what you said, Purvi, about I think reading, especially as, and this is my experience growing up, I was very outdoorsy and I did not enjoy reading till actually the 11th or 12th grade. And then I studied literature. There was
Mm,
something that happened in that high school phase for me. For a long time, my mother used to do this thing where she would just take us to a library, and my sister would read a lot. I would read a lot of Tintin and Asterix and just run around the library and not, read a lot of comics, which you
mm,
say. And that happened for like a good 1 or 2 years. And something clicked, I think, in the third year where I said, this is it. I'm not reading only comics. And then I think my sister realized that I liked cricket, and she gave me a book by a cricketer. It was, I think, Sunil Gavaskar's Sunny Days. And it's actually a very academic book, but I played cricket. And after reading that book, something clicked in my mind where I said, you can read books about things you love doing. And that completely changed my relationship to books. And, in the 11th and 12th grade, I started reading a lot of books I thought I may have enjoyed, like Percy Jackson, Harry Potter. And yeah, I think that was the switch for me. And I feel like if that 2 year period, where my mother was not patient with just staying with
mm,
us didn't happen, I don't know if that click would have happened. And I think what
mm,
you are doing with reading to Z for so long, it is so important because it is really what shapes that. Because I think if you can make a child a lifelong reader, you're giving them a gift that pays back for the rest of their lives. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. But on that note, we come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories. Purvi, this was such an enjoyable conversation. I will be including links to your projects and your work and your wonderful homeschooling blog in the show notes. But thank you, Purvi. This was really, really enjoyable.
Thank you, Abhishek. I hope I didn't bore you,
No,
but
this is
I enjoyed talking to you as well. I think we should maybe meet in person and not have a
um,
screen next time we chat.
that would be lovely. That would be so great, Purvi. And best of luck with this cycle of City as Lab. And for the listeners tuning in, stay tuned for more such episodes from the podcast. And until next time, keep learning.